The office was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Sarah glanced at the clock hanging above the reception desk. 11:47 p.m. She adjusted her scarf, the faint hum of the air conditioning sending a chill across her neck. It was just another late night at the marketing firm, another deadline looming that kept her tethered to her desk long after her colleagues had gone home. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, their sterile glow casting sharp shadows against the walls. Her desk lamp flickered momentarily, a brief pulse that sent a jolt of unease down her spine. She told herself it was just the building's old wiring acting up again. It always did that. Still, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the room felt different tonight, heavier, somehow. She stared at her computer screen, its glow reflecting faintly in the darkened window beside her. The city lights beyond the glass shimmered faintly, a reminder that life continued outside, though here, in the cavernous office, she felt completely isolated. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed her reflection, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something shift behind her. She whipped her head around, heart pounding, but the open-plan office was as empty as it had been all evening. Rows of cubicles stretched out into the darkness, their outlines barely visible under the dim emergency lights that lined the walls. "Get it together, Sarah," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. She reached for her coffee cup and frowned when her hand came up empty. Of course, she'd finished it an hour ago. The kitchen was down the hall, past the break room, and just around the corner. A short walk, harmless. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, the narrow beam slicing through the dim hallway ahead. The office felt different after hours, like a hollow shell of the bustling space it was during the day. Without the chatter of her co-workers and the steady rhythm of keyboards, the quiet pressed in around her, amplifying every small sound, the creak of a chair, the faint rattle of the HVAC system, even her own footsteps. The kitchen door was ajar when she reached it, just as she'd left it earlier. She pushed it open with her shoulder, the hinges squealing in protest. The faint scent of stale coffee and disinfectant greeted her as she stepped inside. Her phone's light caught the edge of the counter, illuminating the coffee machine. She filled her cup quickly, letting the warm aroma calm her frayed nerves. Then she heard it, a faint noise, barely audible over the gurgle of the coffee machine. It wasn't the usual hums and clicks of the office. This was different. It sounded like breathing, slow, deliberate, and far too close. Sarah froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. Her first instinct was to turn, to shine her flashlight across the room, and reassure herself that she was alone. But something held her back. Her mind screamed at her to move, to look, but her body felt like it was stuck in place. Slowly, she let her gaze shift to the polished surface of the microwave door in front of her. Its reflective surface caught just enough of the room behind her, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A figure stood in the doorway, its shape indistinct, like a shadow that refused to settle. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. The coffee machine beeped loudly, startling her into action. She spun around, her phone's flashlight slicing through the room. Nothing. The doorway was empty. The hall beyond was still and silent. The faint hum of the emergency lights, the only sound. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she backed toward the counter, clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to tell herself it was her imagination, just a trick of the light and the late hour playing with her mind. But the lingering feeling of being watched refused to dissipate. Suddenly, the lights in the kitchen flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a brief, suffocating moment before they buzzed back to life. Sarah's phone slipped from her trembling hand, clattering onto the tile floor. She scrambled to retrieve it, her fingers brushing the screen as the flashlight blinked off. When she finally got the light back on, her heart sank. The coffee she'd just poured was now spilled across the counter, the dark liquid dripping slowly onto the floor. She hadn't touched it. A soft creak echoed from the hallway, the sound unmistakable this time. Someone or something was out there. She tightened her grip on her phone and took a cautious step toward the door. Her rational mind screamed at her to run, to leave the building entirely, but a darker curiosity rooted her in place. She had to know.
The hallway stretched out before her, the narrow beam of her flashlight revealing only empty desks and chairs. But the feeling persisted, that she wasn't alone. It followed her as she moved, each step echoing too loudly in the silence. The shadows seemed deeper now, shifting just out of sight, as though something was lurking just beyond her vision. She reached her desk and grabbed her bag, her fingers fumbling with the zipper as she searched for her car keys. The faint sound of a door creaking open somewhere behind her made her freeze. It was distant, but not far enough. Slowly, she turned, her flashlight casting a shaky glow across the room. The open-plan office loomed before her, a maze of cubicles and shadows. And in the distance, at the far end of the room, she saw it again. A figure, barely more than a silhouette, standing motionless, watching. Her breath hitched as the figure shifted, its head tilting unnaturally to one side. Then, with deliberate slowness, it took a step forward. And another. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness again. This time, they didn't come back on. The darkness pressed against Sarah like a living thing, suffocating and impenetrable. Her flashlight sputtered in her trembling hand, its beam flickering weakly before steadying. She strained her eyes, peering into the void where she'd last seen the shadowy figure. Nothing moved, yet the air around her felt alive with unseen motion, a pulsing, malevolent energy that seemed to seep into her skin. She tightened her grip on her bag, her breath shallow and rapid as she tried to steady herself. Her instincts screamed for her to run, to get out of the building and never look back. But her feet remained rooted to the spot. Somewhere deep inside, a morbid curiosity stirred, urging her to uncover whatever was lurking in the darkness. She wasn't sure if it was courage or madness that pushed her forward. The office was deathly silent. No distant hum of machines, no creak of the building settling, just an oppressive, unnatural quiet that made her ears ring. The shadows seemed to ripple and shift around her, as though the darkness itself was alive, watching her, waiting. Every step she took echoed hollowly against the tile floor, the sound bouncing back to her in strange, distorted patterns. She couldn't tell if it was her own footsteps or someone or something else following close behind. Her flashlight beam swept over the cubicles, their walls rising like the skeletal remains of a forgotten labyrinth. She moved slowly, her eyes darting to every corner, every flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. As she rounded a corner, she froze. There, at the far end of the hallway, was the faint outline of a figure. It stood unnaturally still, its silhouette sharp against the faint emergency lights that barely illuminated the corridor. Hello? Sarah's voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It simply stood there, its presence radiating a deep, suffocating dread. And then it began to walk toward her. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and unnervingly fluid, as though it wasn't bound by the natural constraints of a human body. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking wildly in her grip. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. The figure stopped abruptly, just a few feet away, its features still obscured by shadow. The air between them grew heavy, thick with a cloying metallic scent that turned her stomach. Her flashlight flickered again, and for the briefest moment, she caught a glimpse of its face. Or what should have been a face. It was blank, smooth and featureless, like a mannequin carved from darkness. Sarah's scream died in her throat as the figure suddenly dissolved into the shadows, its form melting away like smoke. The hallway was empty again, but the oppressive sense of being watched remained, stronger than ever. She spun around, her flashlight beam darting wildly across the room. A low, guttural sound echoed from somewhere behind her, a deep, rasping exhale that sent a cold wave of terror rippling down her spine. It was close, too close. The lights overhead buzzed violently, flickering in and out as Sarah bolted toward the stairwell. Her shoes slapped against the floor, the sound a frantic rhythm that seemed to chase her through the labyrinth of cubicles. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel it, the presence growing stronger, its malevolence palpable. When she reached the stairwell door, she shoved it open with trembling hands and stumbled inside. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the narrow concrete shaft. She leaned against the wall, gasping for air, her ears straining for any hint of pursuit. The silence was deafening. A faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo from above. She looked up, her flashlight revealing the winding staircase that spiraled into darkness. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like the steady drip of water from a leaky faucet. But it wasn't water. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps descending toward her. Sarah's hands shook as she gripped the railing and began to descend, her steps hurried and uneven. The footsteps above quickened, matching her pace, their echoing rhythm bouncing chaotically off the walls. She dared a glance over her shoulder and immediately regretted it. A dark figure leaned over the railing, several flights above, its elongated limbs stretching impossibly far as it began to climb down the stairwell. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The smell hit her again, stronger this time, metallic and putrid, like rotting meat and rust. It made her gag as she stumbled down the stairs, her legs burning with effort. She didn't know how many floors she'd descended when she finally reached the bottom, slamming into the exit door and bursting into the lobby. The wide, open space was bathed in dim emergency lighting, its usual welcoming atmosphere now cold and alien. The front doors were just ahead, their glass panes reflecting her frantic movements. She sprinted toward them, relief blooming in her chest at the thought of escape. But as her hand touched the door handle, the glass panes flickered. For a split second, the reflection staring back at her wasn't her own. It was a shadowy, featureless figure, its head tilted in an unnatural angle. Sarah screamed, yanking the door open and stumbling out into the cold night air. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, fumbling with her keys and throwing herself inside. Her hands shook as she started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness of the empty parking lot. But as she pulled out onto the road, her rearview mirror caught a glimpse of something in the back seat. A faint shadow shifted just behind her, barely perceptible. Her breath hitched as the oppressive scent of decay filled the car, and the last thing she heard before the mirror shattered was the low, guttural sound of something